Good evening to all. A little housekeeping note. Last week, our session ran over a little bit, and in looking at what didn't get covered, I realized that it should be a session of its own. So I will be covering that, and what was intended for tonight's session will be next week. Also, reminder, this is being recorded. If you have any questions, feel free to either ask, put it on the chat. If you're watching YouTube, you can put it in the chat there. If you have a question and you don't want it to be recorded, wait till the end when I will stop recording. And then if you have a question that you would like to have answered that is not recorded, you can ask a question then. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is search engines, because that is a common area where people can get a little bit tangled up without realizing it, and there are ways to reduce the problems. Now, the first thing to realize is if your filters are properly set, then even if you get a result in your result of the search engine that is inappropriate, the filter should keep you from going there. However, it's generally better to avoid getting into trouble in the first place, especially with younger children who may see the snippet or the title or whatever, and it's not necessarily something you would like them to see. And for yourself, even if you're not worried about that issue, the fact that you won't get those results in your search will give you actually better quality search results. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, whichever search engine you use, they all the ones that I'm aware of currently, which is July of 2020 to anybody who's going to see this later, this is subject to change. But as of July 2022, all the major search engines allow you to do some level of filtering of results. Use those features. Even if you don't set the highest level of filtering, you always want to do some filtering, because what you consider appropriate and what people post are two different, very often majorly different things. And it's funny because there are areas where you wouldn't even think that there might be a problem, but you'd be surprised. And by putting in these basic filters, yes, you occasionally might block something out, but by and large, the better search engines are good at not over filtering. So, the risk is it's very rare that the risk you're taking is that something that you really need is going to get filtered out. And if you really think that's happening, you can always go and set it to a lower level and then set it back. But your default should always be to use at least some level of filtering on your search engine. Okay. Secondly is ads. Okay. One of the things, as I mentioned last time, to use on your computer is ad blockers. All of your search engines make big money on ads. That's one of their major, it's not just Google. They all do. Some use more information, some use less information. DuckDuckGo is a very well-known search engine for people worried about privacy. So they don't use as much of your information to target ads, but they still make money on ads. That's how they're funding themselves. That's how they make money, etc. So it's important to really be aware of this. So one major advantage of Google is most of their advertising is text-based. I believe DuckDuckGo does that as well, which means that even if you get something that's not so appropriate, it is less of a problem than an inappropriate ad that is image-based. In fact, sometimes the simple fact that it's text-based makes all the difference, because many ads are not inappropriate per se, except for the pictures. A cell phone ad can be highly inappropriate, even though there's nothing wrong with cell phones. But if it's a picture of people at the pool enjoying their cell phones, well, you get the picture. No pun intended. I'm sorry, that was not intentional. So this is some something to be aware of. And when you make your choice of which search engine, you really should think about that. I strongly recommend search engines that allow you to get only text-based results as your default. Again, there are situations where that's not your best bet, but that, especially if you're looking for images in the first place. But for things where images are not the key, stuff that gives you text-based results and text-based advertising is really the thing you want to use as your default. Okay. Now, so just some comments on some of the biggest, some of the major current search engines. Okay, so Google generally is a text-based interface. It's an extremely good search engine. Unless you're in incognito mode, it's using a lot of, if you are in incognito mode and you do not have any Google services that you use, then they don't have that much information to use about you in targeting ads, and etc. Otherwise, they track quite a bit of information. They use that information to target ads. They do, but one thing they're good at is they slurp up a lot of information, and it could be, some of that information could be turned over to law enforcement under subpoena. But other than that, they're actually pretty good at protecting your data. Their security is quite good. So if you're just worried about hackers and that kind of stuff, or them selling your data as it stands, they're unlikely to do that. That's not how they make their money. They make more money by holding your data close to the chest and selling access to you via ads. Okay, so that's Google. DuckDuckGo is very privacy focused. They're also text-based, so that's a real plus for people who just don't want to be bombarded with inappropriate images. And they are much more privacy focused, which means that they simply don't. I'm not going to say they're 100% because they do some. Nobody's perfect, but because you don't have other accounts with them generally, and they specifically do not collect a lot of information. If you're, I'm not even so much worried about their security because they simply don't have that much information for some hacker to get at, and they just don't have a lot of information to sell to an advertiser or a researcher or whatever. So if you're concerned about your privacy for any reason, DuckDuckGo, and their search engine's actually pretty good. It's not as good as Google, but it's pretty good. Most of the time, it'll get you what you need. So if you're a little concerned about that, it's a fairly good choice. Bing is a pretty good search engine as search engines go. Again, it's not as good as Google, and I'm really not thrilled with it's very heavily image-based, in fact, which some people like. But if you're worrying about images, which I tend to, because again, a lot of times these are images that in theory are not a major problem, but may not be something you want, coming up on your screen. So like I said, I don't recommend Bing that much, largely because it is, very heavily, there's very often images, and it's also very news-based in a way, and again, news together with images, especially since very often the so-called news is about celebrities and stuff that, knowing who is, some news is actual news and some is, whatever. And in general, celebrity news tends to be the sort of stuff, the culture, the images, etc. I'm not going to say, oh, you should have, that's each person their own, but consider that in general, when you're dealing with stuff like that, sports news, celebrity news, etc., you need to be more mindful and more thoughtful because there's a higher likelihood of stuff that maybe isn't so appropriate, so you need to think about that more. It is a very good search engine, but they also do collect a lot of data, not as much as Google, but they collect a fair amount. And again, if you have an Outlook or Hotmail account, they combine that information as well. So, and again, they do have pretty good security. They don't, over the last few years, they've really ratcheted up the safety of the accounts that they hold. So I'm not really that worried about them getting hacked. But That's just a thing to be aware of. Yahoo is the search engine I simply do not recommend. It is it's a full feed, it's news, it's pictures, it's shopping, everything, so it's very, very, it's going to be very hard to kind of make sure that's really filtered. And it's not like their search results are great. In fact, the primary reason to go to the Yahoo primary page is not search results. At one point, they weren't even doing their own search. They were contracting. I don't remember, they were contracting with Google or Bing or whatever because their search engine had fallen. Even though they wanted to be pioneers, their search engine had fallen so far behind that they weren't even doing their own search. Some people still use them for email, which I'm going to say, please don't do that. They have a terrible, of all of the major email providers, they have a terrible, terrible reputation. Hotmail used to be the only thing that was, was the worst, but then it was bought by Microsoft a number of years ago, and it took them a while, but they've gotten to a point where basically Hotmail and Outlook, which is Microsoft, are both using the same backend. Basically, they've gotten the security to a point where, I'm not assuming that you're going to be hacked or that you were hacked in the last 3 years. Yahoo, forget it. I mean, yes, they were bought by Verizon and then they were sold. And I have no idea what their current owners are doing. They have no track record. But Yahoo itself, the infrastructure is, Verizon bought an infrastructure that was basically broken, and they did not realize this until they closed the deal. And it was big news for those who follow this stuff. So my recommendation is do not use Yahoo. There's really no good reason to. If that's your primary email account, open up another email account, Outlook, Google, whatever, and maybe for the next 6 months automatically, forward everything and then kind of close yourself out. Or keep Yahoo, for all those throwaway accounts that you use just for, shopping or whatever. So that is the really big thing with search engines. And again, it sounds like a small thing, but for so many people, a major part of their interface with the internet, especially on their computer, is the search engine. And therefore, it is really worthwhile to really think about which search engine you're using, be mindful about it, tweak the settings. It takes a few minutes, but that few minutes really makes a difference in the quality of your results, not just in how well it matches what you're looking for, but in how well it matches with what you don't want to see. So the other major thing is that, we were talking about the types of tools last week, filters, parental controls, etc. The other piece of that set of tools that you need is antivirus/anti-malware. What do I mean? So a lot of these suites are called antivirus, but they do more than viruses. Viruses are specifically programs that get themselves onto your computer one way or another and either use and do a variety of problematic things. So, sometimes they'll just, they're just malicious and intended just to do damage, just pure vandalism. That is not the most common thing. If it's just pure vandalism, if you have backups, then and I'm not getting into backups, not this session, not next session. That is something that that's another whole session on its own. Unless somebody specifically wants, me to do a session on backups, we'll do that afterwards, but I'm not getting to that. But if you do have backups and you get vandalized, you can just basically restore your data and you'll be fine. More often than not, viruses and other types of malware that get onto your computer do things that are a lot nastier. They find your data, which, it's not just they find your pictures and use them. They will do things like find your passwords. They will find your banking data. They will, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give you an example of something that happened to me a few years ago, somebody was able to hack into my cell phone. My cell phone carrier is AT&T. They hacked into my cell phone carrier and they ordered a significant amount of equipment from AT&T, which wasn't me, it was my husband. We were hacked and we pulled them up. They were really very good. Not all vendors are so good. They were really good about it. It was the first time they made us they made us change all our passwords. They forced us to do something called two-factor authentication, which I will talk about next week in terms of protecting your accounts. And they, reversed all the charges, which was great. That won't always happen. There are rules about, like, if your bank account gets hacked, et cetera, et cetera. But those rules, if somebody empties your bank account, you are out of luck. Okay. If somebody gets certain information about you and opens a credit card account in your name and racks up $10,000 worth of charges, you probably can get it cleared up, probably, but it will almost certainly affect your credit, and it will take hours and hours and hours of time over the course of months. And I don't envy anybody the Agnes Nefesh. I have spoken to people, I've read up about it. This is no joke. Okay. So you do not want your computer to be hacked, or your computer can become part of a botnet where it's used. So what you'll see is just a slowdown in performance, but your computer is being used for other attacks, etc. Which again, you may not care. There is the slowdown, but the problem is that, say, when the organizations that chase the stuff down take down a botnet like that, it could create a problem for you. Now, when Microsoft or the FBI or the consortia that do this take these botnets down, they don't do it in order to. They try to avoid collateral damage, of the people whose computers were hijacked, but it happens. It may just take you down for a few days till you get stuff sorted out. There may be broader damage. You may find yourself being investigated over something that you have nothing. I mean, again, generally, if you're just an innocent victim and your computer got hijacked, it usually becomes pretty clear. Most of the better cyber teams know enough of what they're doing to see that. But who needs it? Who needs that kind of aggravation? Those of you, we talk about audits, like in the nonprofit sector, we talk about everybody hates audits, even people who do things 100% whatever, because they take time and energy, and you have to deal with all this stuff and whatever. By the same token, you don't really need people, the FBI or whoever investigating you over this, even though you're 100% clean, et cetera, et cetera. It's just an aggravation, and nobody needs that kind of aggravation. But that's the least of your problems in the broad spectrum of events. There is the effect on your performance, and there's the very, very real. Most of the people who hijack computers for botnets don't just do that. They do that, but they also sell other kinds of access to your data and your files and your personal information and your access to your bank account, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to keep your computer protected as far as that's concerned. Now, very often, these suites, are part of a bigger package. Like, for instance, Norton, McAfee, Sophos, they have a antivirus, and then they have a suite, and that suite often will come, like in the case of Norton, it comes with both a filter and parental controls. McAfee has a filter, but not parental controls, etc. Each one has its own. NetSpark, I believe, has an additional antivirus. So you can say, okay, I'm going to get this antivirus and that filter and parental controls, or you can get a package of everything. It doesn't really matter. Just you need to make sure that before you make your final decision, you need to make sure that everything works together. Now, the single most important thing on the antivirus, anti-malware scanners is there's what's called on-demand and background. Okay, there are a number of free on-demand scanners that are pretty good. Okay, but on-demand scanning is not adequate, because that means you have to remember to do this on a regular basis. And in the interim, you could wind up somebody, say you do this every week, right? In between, you could get hijacked. And in that 3 days till you do your next scan, somebody can slurp up all this data and, like I said, all these things that can go wrong. And by and large, these folks work very, very quickly. They find your credit card information, find your bank account information. They either use it or sell it immediately before you ever find out. And you may never even know that this stuff happened. So it's really, on demand is only really useful as a second, like, the belt and suspenders. Okay. Like, I will sometimes have a situation where I think maybe my regular scanner missed something, because it's true. No scanner is 100% effective. The best ones are like 99, 98, 99% effective, but stuff happens. And so it is possible for something to slip through. And that's where the on-demand scanner comes in handy. But you definitely always want something that's running in the background, because what that does is it will scan every file that gets downloaded. And the best ones also do something else. They scan for behavior. So what happens is, and some of this is an overlap with what the operating system does, and I'll discuss that next week when I talk about that. But basically, what it does is it scans for certain behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense. It scans files. If it's for instance, I use Norton just as an example, but this is a common thing that many of the better scanners do. So it has a list of what's called signatures, where it knows that these viruses show these particular strings in any file that's infected with this virus. So it looks for that. Then it looks for files that are known to be infected. So say you're downloading something, a zip file, and it will check inside the zip file and see that there's this little add-on file there that doesn't belong there. It actually is a file that we know is unsafe. Then it also has a list of known safe files, which generally they don't do this like for document files or whatever, but for things that you can run, right? So you're downloading a program, it has a list, and they keep like these humongous databases. Okay, and then they don't just base it on file names. They look at the size and other technical aspects of the file, and they match it up. Okay, and that's why sometimes it'll actually delay a download or an installation by a few seconds. That's because they're checking it against these enormous, and when I say enormous, I mean literally billions of files that obviously they're using very high scale, systems, but they're checking this against these really, really large databases. And what sometimes happens to me on a regular basis, I'll be downloading a file that I know is safe. I trust where I'm getting it from, but because Norton is not familiar with it, it'll pop up and say, hey, are you sure you want to download this? Are you sure you want to install it? And that's really good, because so when it's something I know I downloaded and I know where I'm downloading from and I know why the vendor doesn't have this in their file, I will say, yes, download it, and yes, install it, right? But if this is like some site that I'm not so sure about anyway, I might think twice. Or this might pop up if there's something called a drive-by. This is another area why you want the on-demand scanner. There's something called drive-by downloads, and generally this does not happen on reputable sites. But A, sometimes you're not on such a great site, and B, sometimes those sites get hacked. Now, this is happening a little less frequently as the bigger sites, are being more careful with their security, but it happens. I remember, about 2.5 years ago, the New York Times had their site hacked. And it was a very small hack, which is why they did not realize for about a week that this had happened. But basically, somebody had managed to tweak their site just enough that if you went to their site, it downloaded a file that automatically ran and installed some not so good stuff on your computer. Okay, now if you had an on-demand scanner, it would have popped up and said, hey, do you want to run this thing? And you would have hopefully realized that I never told anything to download. Why is this downloading? and you would have said no. And that would then the scanner would put it in its database of unsafe stuff. And the next person who downloaded it, maybe your next door neighbor, ran into the same problem. And at that point, Norton already knows that this is not safe. And it's just going to say, nope, this is blocked, not letting it download. So that's why having a background scanner is really, really useful. So in my case, what I generally do is I've got a background scanner running. If I have a question as something is going on, I will download something called Malwarebytes, which is a very good scanner. Again, they have a background scanner if you want to use that as your primary scanner. Since I use a different one, which for my purposes works better because it has the filter and the parental controls, etc. I use that as my on-demand scanner. I download the latest version, run it, and make sure that there's not something that my current scanner missed. Okay. So here is the thing that's really important. You need to have a background scanner running all the time. And I do not know of any good background scanner that is free. Like I've mentioned before, you need to budget for this stuff. You don't have to get the most expensive whatever, but you have to budget for this. You need to have the background scanner, and these are very expensive to maintain. All of these scanners, all of the background scanners do something else. Every week, sometimes more often, they update themselves. Sometimes they do this on a weekly basis. They phone home, so to speak, and update themselves. Sometimes the company does on a push basis. So every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 days, depending on what's going on, they'll be pushing out updates, both to the signature files, to the scanning, the behavior scanning. There's something called heuristics where they see rules that when they see that a file looks a certain way or behaves a certain way, that this is a potential problem that needs to be, maybe it needs to alert you, or maybe it needs to block it, or whatever. And because the bad guys are constantly updating themselves and upgrading their armament, it's an arms race essentially. So the scanning people, also the antivirus people, are constantly updating and upgrading and doing all this extra work. And so if you want to be running something that does the updates, you need to be willing to budget for it. And it's frustrating, it's annoying, but there really is no such thing as a free lunch. So most of these folks do the on-demand scanner for free, not all of them, but most of them do, because it is useful. And sometimes it actually causes people to come to them, like, say somebody decides they don't like Norton anymore because, they don't need the filter anymore. They don't need the parental controls anymore. They prefer a different filter for whatever reason. They decide they want to go to, say, one of the filters that does skin tone, whatever. So Norton doesn't have especially, and Norton has too much of, an impact or whatever. So, or maybe it's just, the end of the year, it's time, to upgrade. And it's like, what? I don't need these two pieces of it. I'm going to go with a different, maybe I'll go with a different scanner. I like the one that I downloaded last, 3 months ago. I'm going to go with that one instead. So, also, doing the on-demand scanning serves their purposes. Their bread and butter is not from the on-demand scanning. Their bread and butter is from the background scanning. So but you have to choose one. It doesn't really matter which one. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all, because you do want a good one, but there are a number of really good background scanners out there. Choose one, pay for it, and either update it on a yearly basis or find another one if you don't like the one you have, but put that in. It's part of that belt and suspenders that you absolutely need to have for if you want to keep your computer safe. This is not so much. This stuff is not so much for the inappropriate kind of stuff, but it is for the scammers. It is for the people who will steal your identity. Who if there's something on your computer that is sensitive or personal or very, very private, you don't want the whole world to know. These folks will be very happy to blackmail you if they think they can. I mean, they try to blackmail people even who don't have something sensitive, whatever, Um, but these kinds of people will do that too. And again, it doesn't. I'm not even talking about people who are doing things that are inappropriate, but depending on how savvy and what the specifics are, there are people who will see evidence of medical issues, for instance, and threaten you to broadcast it to the whole world, right? Or whatever it is. So you really, really, and if your line of work requires that you work with other people's sensitive information, the last thing you ever want is for anybody to be able to hack your computer and find someone else's sensitive information. That's another whole level of responsibility that you have to other people. And that is both the moral, probably halachic. I haven't really asked the Rav about it because there's the more, there's also legal responsibility. If you work with sensitive information, in most fields, there are actually legal ramifications to that. Like if you're dealing with student information, if you're dealing with what's called protected health information, depending on what state you're in, there are other types of information that needs to be protected. And that's, by the way, why many organizations will not let you use your own computer for, even if you're working from home, or if you are working from home and using your own computer, they'll make you jump through certain hoops because, depending on what they have, for instance, in New York, aside from the federal laws around education and the health information, etc., there's a whole host of data that if you are doing a whole range of services that you would think are sensitive, but they consider it sensitive, and you need to protect that data. So if you work for an organization that has those kinds of contracts with city or state agencies, just as an example, your organization is going to want to make sure that your computer is properly protected, or that you're not downloading their data onto your personal computer. Just as an example, of at that level. If you're working as a consultant, if you're working with that kind of data, you may actually be legally covered by that. Just an FYI, So it's really important. It's really important to be, cognizant of that. But even aside from the legal issues, there's a responsibility if you're dealing with sensitive information. There's a responsibility also as a pragmatic thing. If people know that you're careless with their information, it's like if you're walking in the street and you drop somebody else's social security card, right? Nobody would ever trust you with any of the documents again. Same thing with your computer. If it gets out that somebody hacked your computer and found someone else's information, if your business in any way, shape, or form requires, working with other people, even if it's keeping other people's credit card information because you're taking credit card payments, whatever, But again, but even if none of that applies to you, if it's just your own data, if you have anything sensitive, you don't want that out there. If you have your credit card information, you have your bank account information, you have a healthcare portal that you log into for your doctors records, for your kids' doctors' records. You don't want any of that exposed. So, and one of the really important ways to keep that protected is to avoid getting this kind of malware on your system. Again, the other issue of protecting accounts we will discuss next week. But, you want it is always important to recognize, like, for instance, in a car, right? You need to drive safely, you need to drive smartly, and you need to use seatbelts. You have to have good brakes. You want to have good airbags, etc. You need both the technology and the ways, the way you set yourself up and the way you behave to keep yourself, it's like there are layers to this. So this session and last session were the technology layers that you need to have in place to keep yourself safe. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so I do not see any comments in either the live stream or on the Zoom. So I'm going to stop recording. Last session will be next week, same time. and I am stopping to record. Now, if there is anything you want to ask that you didn't want recorded, now is the time. Okay. So I am going to take it that there are no further questions. I will see you next week, 8:30 Monday night. Same link, same information. All of this, by the way, is posted. If you missed the prior sessions, it's all on YouTube. And if anybody is interested in the link, you should be able to check on YouTube. But if you need to, if you have my cell phone number, you can WhatsApp me or you can email me at kazazajek@gmail.com, and I will be more than happy to send you the link. And to all, a very good night.